Today is September the 5th. Today, we'll find virtue in strange places as we read the book of Ruth. Today, as you read through the Bible in a year, I'd like you to read the book of Ruth. Ruth is a very interesting book. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, it occurs immediately after the book of Proverbs. Our Bible, which follows the Latin Vulgate and the Septuagint before it, places Ruth at the end of the book of Judges. We'll see why all of this occurs in just a second. Ruth occurs right after Proverbs. It's the first of the writings, extra books that were included in the Hebrew Bible. That's important because if you remember in Proverbs chapter 31, the very end of the book of Proverbs is a psalm to the virtuous woman who can find her. The word for virtue there is the word for being noble, being appropriate, and virtuous woman who can find her. The reason this is important in the book of Ruth is because in Ruth chapter 3, verse 11, Boaz, after Ruth essentially proposes to Boaz, Boaz says, "Don't worry about a thing, my daughter. I'll do what's necessary. Everyone in town knows you're a virtuous woman." Ruth is the only woman in the Old Testament that is called virtuous. It's not by accident that it occurs right after Proverbs 31, the hymn to the virtuous woman. This is the Bible, the Bible collectors and organizers letting us know that Ruth is the physical example of Proverbs 31. A virtuous woman who can find her. As you read through what Proverbs 31 is about, it's embodied in the person of Ruth. Now, in addition to that, in Ruth chapter 2, verse 1, there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz. That word, he was wealthy and he was virtuous. He was noble. The very same word that's applied to Ruth is also applied to Boaz. In Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, you will have noticed that Ruth occurs in the days when the judges ruled in Israel. At this point, we've just finished reading the book of Judges. Now, because Ruth occurs during the time of Judges, when the Septuagint and the Vulgate organized their Bible, I think they kind of lost the impact of Proverbs 31 and Ruth 3:11, that Ruth was the example of the virtuous woman. And instead, they said, oh, this belongs with the historical books. Well, certainly historically, it occurs during the time of the book of Judges. Now, if you remember, as we concluded the book of Judges, we saw just how bad things had gotten in Israel. So bad that to find an example of a virtuous woman, they had to go to Moab. Ruth is indeed the virtuous woman, but she's not an Israelite. We find virtue in strange places in the book of Ruth. So why is Ruth included in the Old Testament? Well, because as we see at the end of chapter 4, Ruth is the grandmother of King David, the great-grandmother of King Solomon, who wrote about the virtuous woman. Could it be that Solomon was thinking of his great-grandmother when he wrote those words? I don't know. But we find virtue in strange places. Look around yourself today. Where do you find virtue? Be open to finding virtue in places that you wouldn't necessarily think you would find it. Like, follow, and subscribe to this devotional on whatever platform you use to listen to it. Email your questions to us at questions@becomehope.com. Tomorrow, we'll read about Samuel's rise to the priesthood.